Thank you for the invitation. I think when we talk about Morocco and we analyze or like to analyze the current situation, one of the first question we should ask is what happened? What happened to this promising country? Because if we go back to the early 2000s, Morocco was full of promises in terms of democratization, in terms of freedom of the press. Morocco had one of the most vibrant independent media in the region. Morocco passed some of the most progressive women's status laws in the region. We had what was supposed to be the equivalent of the Truth Commission, the first one in the region too, called the Equity and Reconciliation Commission. So what happened to all of that? I think this is a very worthy question for us today. I think, first of all, for those who have been following in detail what was going on in Morocco, they have seen the writings on the wall, because the first bannings of newspapers started in 2000. The first two major bannings started in 2000. And in fact, don't take my word for it. Just go to the Freedom of the Press indicator of Freedom House, or Reporters Without Borders Freedom of the Press Index, or the governance indicators of the World Bank. And you will see something which for some might appear amazing, which is that Morocco had peaked in terms of indices of human rights, of freedoms, etc., in 2000s. And in fact, since 2000, Morocco either stagnated or declined on these indices. And the reason for this is a bit difficult to unpack. Because, and this is one of the problems for Moroccan activists and people who are fighting for democratization, is that we are suffering of something called the curse of the bad neighborhood. We are constantly compared to what's happening in the rest of the region. And for sure, for a long time, Morocco appeared as being, despite its problems, as being much more progressive when it came to human rights than its neighbors. Things started to change in 2011. Now, if one might say, wait a minute, something called a new constitution happened in 2011. That's true, but we need to remember that this new constitution was voted, I would say, under duress, because it was after the start of what we call the Arab Spring and massive demonstrations in the streets of the major cities of Morocco. So, and I say under duress because really the proof is in the pudding, is what happened afterwards. You know, if the constitution beautiful slogans were lived up to by the regime, we would have seen it. We would have had an independent judiciary, we would have had an independent press, etc. And that didn't happen. And that means that, in fact, as the US framers of the US Constitution said, it's a parchment guarantee. It's not a real constitution. And that's what happens with the Moroccan constitution. It's just a parchment guarantee and not a true constitution. So I think answering the question why have we witnessed this evolution? I think there are a couple of things here. One of them is panic, and I think that the Moroccan regime is really panicking because it has realized its failure to produce the kind of institutions that would produce the kind of social and economic stability that would induce, of course, political stability. The first sign was, the first major signal was 2011, but the second major signal was what happened in the Rif Mountains in 2017. And I think it's the sheer realization that our political elites are unwilling to establish the right type of institution to allow for true economic development that lead them today to go after those who express the discontent that is resulting from this failure. And by the way, after having almost annihilated independent institution in media, now what they are doing is going after the individuals, because when we look at the long list of people who have thrown in jail for bogus charges, and because, in fact, of what they said about the regime, they are individuals. They are rarely attached to any institution. Why? Because years ago, the regime was able to get rid of these institutions. So there is panic, but there is also, I think, a certain sense of entitlement. And the sense of entitlement is because the regime thinks that it's still the sole guarantor of stability in the country. And that's and this is a message toward some elites in Morocco, some social elites, but also a lot toward its allies, among them the United States. Which brings me to the other source of entitlement, a more recent one. It has been said earlier that the US foreign policy establishment never missed an opportunity basically to extol the level of cooperation on security issues, on terrorism, etc., and the normalization of ties with Israel was mentioned. I am afraid that these issues are considered by the Moroccan regime as the get out of free jail cards, basically, with the US elites. Basically, the idea here, it's because we are cooperating with you in fighting terrorism. It's because despite the opinion of our own citizens, in last summer, there was a poll in Morocco, 88% of Moroccans claimed that they were against normalization, although, by the way, a majority are in favor of the two-state solution. It needs to be underscored, but 88% claimed that they were against normalizing ties with Israel. And despite that, the Moroccan regime basically forced on its own population normalizing ties with Israel. And I mean by that, why is that important to take into account? Because it means that in the mind of the power elites in Morocco, they have made a sacrifice. They have sacrificed something to assuage the United States, to support US foreign policy interests in the region. And what they're probably expecting in return is basically no criticism in terms of human rights performance. Same thing with terrorism. You know, now we know it has been documented even by UN bodies that we see the return of systemic torture in Morocco. Same story here. Because Morocco is cooperating with US ally and Western ally, then there is this notion that it can get away with that type of crimes. And I have to say here that this looks familiar, and it looks familiar because it is familiar. That's what happened during the Cold War too, when US allies and Western allies, authoritarian regimes, thought that because they were towing the line of Western interests, they can get away with human rights abuses. So I think it behooves us to keep these issues in mind, especially from the US perspective. And there is a last point that I'd like to tackle here: the lack of democracy.
Quickly, please.
Yes, the lack of democracy, in fact, has other nefarious consequences, and I mean by that economic mismanagement, predation, and rentierism. Because of the absence of democratic institutions, public investments were directed toward flashy projects with dubious economic impacts. Billions went to high-speed trains while the education system was in shambles. Morocco is the country in the region with the highest proportion of youth willing to leave the country, worse than war-torn countries such as Yemen. Urban youth unemployment in Morocco, which is a sure predictor of social unrest, hovers around 40%. The ruling elites are using their total control of state institutions to carve themselves dominant positions in the major sectors of the economy. Morocco's ruling family controls the biggest bank, the biggest insurance company, the energy production sector, the biggest private education company, one of the 3 telecom companies of the country, among other things. And this tight grip on the economy by non-accountable players edges out the true entrepreneurs and risk takers. In sum, those who create wealth and jobs, a sine qua non conditions for long-lasting stability. So let me conclude with a sad and ironic story. Omar Radi, the young, brilliant investigative journalist who was sentenced to 6 years in jail for, among other alleged crimes, espionage, the Moroccan state claimed that Omar had acted as a spy when he worked as a consultant with a London-based company specialized in country risk analysis and catering to the demands of international investors. And here is the sad irony. A few weeks ago, the investment project Omar consulted for went through. Thanks in part to his work, close to dozens of millions of dollars were invested in the Moroccan agricultural sector. The US government should help its ally to democratize and make sure that it is not free-riding US strategic interests to repress its citizens. Thank you for your attention.
I think it behooves us to talk also about independentis whose human rights and freedom of speech is being stifled, especially, and it has to do with US foreign policy. I happen to have been the first Moroccan to interview Mohamed Abdelaziz, the leader of the Polisario, back in 2000, and my magazine was banned because I interviewed the leader of the Polisario at the time. And the reason I decided to interview him, it's because I have met with a high-ranking US diplomat who told me that we have decided with Morocco to put on the table what at the time was called the third way, which is the autonomy instead of independence. So in other words, the third solution, which is not independence or total Moroccan sovereignty, which is the autonomy, has been something in the works for a couple of decades, if not more than that now. And my point here is the following, is that Morocco, by its human rights abuses, is not helping its friends to help it. By basically going after the freedom of expression rights of Sahrawis, independentists and Moroccan Democrats, it makes the effort, or it makes the role that has to be played by its allies, and the US is a Moroccan ally on this issue, like Spain, like France, much more difficult, because it will be hard for them to sell to the international community the autonomy plan while the Moroccan government is violating human rights. Well, let me tell you something about US intervention. I can attest to the fact, and I can give you very precise examples of situations where there were human rights abuses and sometimes targeting journalists. And it was thanks to the US intervention that the cases were solved. When the US foreign policy establishment deigned to intervene, it had an effect. Ali al-Marabd, I am sure, was released from jail because the US State Department intervened. Aminatu Haidar was able to go back home because Hillary Clinton intervened. Ali Anuzla was released because the US State Department had answered one of the questions we asked as a media, whether the US thinks that Ali Anuzla was a terrorist, and they said no. So if the US and basically the NSA tells you you're not a terrorist, you're not a terrorist, basically. And that helped, I think, release Ali Anuzla. So we cannot underestimate the impact of, and I'm not, by the way, as a Moroccan citizen, not something I'm proud of. You know, it's never a source of pride to claim that another country has an influence on your own country. But since there is an influence, let's make it a positive one, right? And the influence is there. So if the US State Department and the US government decides to weigh in, you know, results will ensue. I'm pretty sure about that. In terms of the way forward, I think that we need to realize that Morocco is in the process of forgive me for these big words, inventing its future. And it needs its creative forces, it needs its Democrats to be able to come up with a way forward. The problem with the current regime, it is aborting these trials, these attempts. It is basically depriving the Moroccan society from its ability to produce the intellectual resources to face the challenges of the future. And it goes through democratization. We cannot have a sustainable economy with such level of rentierism. We cannot have there is this sad statistics about Moroccan degree holder who are willing to leave the country. And when they're asked, why do you want to leave the country? The first reason is not money, is not a material one, is quality of life, because there is a salary there. I never say the salary, their quality of life. For a young engineer living in a country where the police can put a camera in your bedroom and shame you with it, is not a country to live in. So because they have global tradable, marketable skills, they prefer to go to code in the US or in France, etc. And Morocco needs to hold on this very important human resources. So the only way for the allies to make sure that Morocco is a durably stable country is to make sure that Morocco democratizes in the most peaceful way possible. And the way to do that is basically to say its positions and to establish its positions and its discontent whenever there is an attempt to silence those voices.